What if I told you there's an ancient letter written by someone who saw Jesus up close, someone who didn't believe in him at first, but then had their entire world turned upside down? This is the story of Saul, the Apostle Paul. He was known as Saul before his conversion to Christianity. This man started out as Jesus's worst enemy, only to become his most passionate follower. His letter might hold the most accurate depiction of Jesus ever recorded. Saul was no ordinary man. He was smart, educated, and driven. He lived during the time when Jesus was gaining followers, but he wanted nothing to do with him. In fact, he was so against the teachings of Jesus that he made it his mission to hunt down anyone who followed him. Saul was traveling to Damascus one day when an incredible event occurred. A bright, blinding light appeared out of nowhere, knocking him to the ground. Then a voice called out his name, not once but twice. "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Saul, now completely terrified and unable to see, asked, "Who are you, Lord?" The answer came back like a thunderclap. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." For the next 3 days, Saul sat in complete darkness. He didn't eat, he didn't drink. He found himself alone with his thoughts, recognizing the errors in everything he had believed. But this moment wasn't just about Saul, it was a message for all of us. Sometimes we can be so sure of ourselves, so blind to the truth, that it takes something earth-shattering to open our eyes. And that's what Jesus did for Saul. This miraculous encounter began one of history's greatest transformations. Saul's sight returned after those 3 arduous days, but he was no longer the same person. From that moment on, he was no longer Saul, the enemy of Jesus. He became Paul, the apostle, one of the greatest champions of Christianity. And in his many letters, especially the one to the Romans, he gave us what may be the most accurate depiction of Jesus ever written. Around 5 AD, Saul was born in the city of Tarsus, raised in a strict Jewish family, and instructed to adhere to the laws of the Pharisees. His mission was to protect his faith at any cost, even if that meant persecuting others. But everything changed on that fateful day around 34-36 AD, when Saul was traveling to Damascus. He believed they were spreading dangerous lies that threatened the Jewish traditions he held so dear. This wasn't just a casual mission. He believed it was his divine duty to stop the spread of Christianity. Armed with authority from Jewish leaders, Saul headed toward Damascus, ready to arrest anyone who claimed to follow Jesus. He was unaware of the impending destruction of his life and his entire belief system. In that single moment, everything Saul believed crumbled. He had dedicated his life to fighting against Jesus, yet here was Jesus standing before him in his divine glory. God sent a man named Ananias, a disciple of Jesus living in Damascus, to help Saul on the 3rd day. At first, Ananias was hesitant. After all, Saul had a reputation as a brutal persecutor of Christians. However, God reassured him that he had now selected Saul for a unique mission. When Ananias placed his hands on Saul and prayed for him, something miraculous happened. Ananias restored Saul's sight, causing something like scales to fall from his eyes and restoring his ability to see. But this wasn't just a return to physical sight, it was the beginning of Saul's spiritual transformation. From that moment on, he wasn't the same person. Saul became Paul, a name that would be known throughout history as one of the most important figures in Christianity. The man who had once hunted down believers was now ready to spread the message of Jesus to the world. In fact, Paul would go on to write many letters that still shape Christian thought to this day. It doesn't matter how far you've strayed or how much you've opposed the truth, God's grace is always there to pull you back. If Paul, a man who actively persecuted Christians, could experience redemption, then anyone can too. Just like Saul, many of us are walking around blind to the truth, blind to the light of Jesus. And if we don't open our eyes soon, we could miss the most important transformation of our lives. In many of Paul's letters, he focuses on Jesus' divine nature, a perspective shaped by his direct encounter on the road to Damascus. For Paul, Jesus wasn't simply a good teacher or a prophet. He wasn't just the man who performed miracles or gave sermons on love. Jesus was far more than that. He was the risen Son of God, cloaked in divine glory, existing in a realm beyond human comprehension. One of the clearest descriptions of Jesus' divine nature comes from Paul's letter to the Philippians. Paul writes in this letter that, though Jesus was in the form of God, he did not count equality with God as something to grasp, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. Philippians 2:6-7. This passage reveals a Jesus who, despite being fully divine, chose to humble himself and live among humanity. But when Paul met Jesus after his resurrection, it wasn't the humble servant he encountered, it was the glorified, all-powerful Christ. Paul describes a Jesus full of light, radiating a glory so intense that it left Saul blind. Imagine the awe and fear of standing in the presence of a being so powerful that his very presence overwhelms your senses. This is the Jesus Paul wants everyone to understand. The one who is both majestic and merciful, commanding and compassionate. In another one of Paul's letters, this time to the Colossians, he goes even deeper into explaining who Jesus is. Paul says, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation." Colossians 1:15. This is a profound statement. Jesus isn't just a reflection of God. He is the visible representation of the invisible God. Jesus embodies every aspect of God's character, including his love, justice, and power. Jesus is God manifested rather than a historical figure. When you look at him, you are seeing God himself. And this wasn't something Paul understood only through teachings or scripture. It was something he experienced. The Apostle John in the book of Revelation describes another vision of Jesus, describing eyes like blazing fire, feet like bronze glowing in a furnace, and a voice like the sound of rushing waters. Revelation 1:14-15. Paul's experience aligns with this, further solidifying his understanding that Jesus, in his post-resurrection form, was more than a man. He was the full embodiment of divine power. Paul's depiction of Jesus doesn't just stop at his divine power, it extends into his role as judge and savior. In the letter to the Romans, Paul emphasizes the importance of being ready to meet Jesus, writing that we must all stand before the judgment seat of Christ, Romans 14:10. This isn't a distant theoretical idea. Paul knew firsthand that Jesus was not only filled with love and grace, but also held the authority to judge the living and the dead. Paul's letter to the Romans explains that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, Romans 3:23. The good news is that Jesus can rescue us from this darkness. We can be ready to see him in his full glory, not as enemies or blind followers, but as those who truly know him. Paul's powerful portrayal of Jesus doesn't aim to intimidate us. Yes, it's overwhelming, and yes, it demands that we prepare, but it's also filled with hope. Paul saw Jesus as the bridge between humanity and God, the one who brings us out of spiritual blindness and into the light of truth. Paul's letters challenge us to be ready to prepare our hearts for the moment we come face to face with Jesus in his full glory. It's not enough to know of him. We must truly see him for who he is. Before his encounter with Jesus, Saul was living in a kind of spiritual darkness, though he didn't know it. He was fiercely committed to his beliefs, educated in Jewish law, and convinced that the followers of Jesus were a threat to everything he held sacred. He saw himself as a defender of the faith, acting in God's name by persecuting Christians. But this self-assurance was, in fact, misguided zeal. Like Saul, many of us may feel confident in our beliefs, convinced that we know what is true and right. But what happens when we discover that we've been wrong all along? This story is a cautionary tale about how easy it is to mistake human conviction for divine truth. His blindness after encountering Jesus on the road to Damascus was not just a physical condition, it was a representation of his inability to see the truth about God. We often live in a similar state, spiritually blind to the real nature of Jesus and his purpose. We may go through life thinking we understand faith, religion, or morality, when in reality we're stumbling in the dark, unable to truly grasp the bigger picture. For Saul, the moment of enlightenment didn't come until 3 days after his encounter with Jesus. He had time to contemplate his beliefs during those days of darkness. He couldn't see, eat, or drink. All he could do was think about the voice he had heard, the blinding light, and the message from Jesus. These days of blindness weren't just a punishment. They were an opportunity for Saul to truly understand the depth of his spiritual ignorance. His loss of sight compelled him to adopt a new perspective, introspection, and the realization that he had been mistaken about everything. The key lesson is that sometimes we must relinquish everything we depend on to gain a true understanding. This experience of enlightenment is one that we all need. It's not enough to go through life thinking we know who Jesus is. We must have our own moment of revelation, where the scales fall from our eyes, and we see him clearly for the first time. Paul combined his deep understanding of Jewish law with the new revelation of Christ, providing a bridge between the old and new covenants. His words reflected a radically transformed person, speaking with both intellect and passion. His letters weren't just educational, they were personal and heartfelt, often written from places of suffering, such as prisons, where Paul's faith shone through even in the darkest circumstances. One aspect we haven't explored yet is the immense suffering Paul endured for the sake of the gospel. After his conversion, Paul's life was far from easy. He faced persecution, imprisonment, beatings, shipwrecks, and countless threats to his life. Yet through all of this, his faith never wavered. In fact, it only grew stronger, and his letters reflect that resilience. In 2 Corinthians 11:24-28, Paul recounts some of the trials he faced. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. I endured beatings with rods 3 times, stoned once, shipwrecked 3 times, and spent a night and a day at sea. Despite these hardships, Paul's focus remained on spreading the gospel and building the early church. This suffering wasn't just incidental, it was central to Paul's message. He frequently reminded his readers that following Christ doesn't mean a life free from difficulty. Instead, he pointed to Jesus as the ultimate example of endurance through suffering, encouraging believers to remain faithful no matter what trials they faced. He wrote from a place of great hardship for his faith, making his writings more powerful. Paul lived in a time of deep division between Jews and Gentiles, and one of his greatest missions was to bring these two groups together under the common banner of Christ. In his letter to the Galatians, Paul famously wrote, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." Galatians 3:28. If you have been moved by Paul's incredible story and feel inspired to see more content like this, consider supporting us with a super thanks. Your contribution helps us keep sharing these powerful stories, spreading knowledge, and continuing our mission of exploring the truth together. Paul's journey from a determined persecutor of Christians to one of the most influential apostles in history is a remarkable testament to the power of grace and transformation. His encounter with the risen Jesus, his experience of blindness and enlightenment, and his tireless efforts to spread the gospel have left a legacy that continues to shape the faith of millions around the world. Through his writings, we get a glimpse of who Jesus truly is, not just a historical figure, but the living, glorified Son of God, radiating with divine power and love. Paul's letters reveal something incredibly important, that no matter how lost we may feel, no matter how wrong we've been, there's always a path back to truth. Like Paul, we can undergo our own moment of revelation, where our spiritual blindness lifts and we see clearly for the first time. The truth of Jesus and ourselves must be confronted in this moment. It's a call to reflect on our beliefs, to challenge our assumptions, and to be open to the possibility of change. The legacy of Paul's life is one of incredible faith, resilience, and hope. His letters encourage us to press on in the face of trials, to embrace the grace that God offers us, and to live in the light of truth. As we close this journey into Paul's depiction of Jesus, let it be a reminder that no one is beyond the reach of God's love. We all have the responsibility to perceive Jesus clearly, embrace life with courage, and spread the message of hope to others. Thanks for watching. Join our community by subscribing to this channel. Until the next video.